Welcome to my lesson on the SVG Goo filter. Today I'm going to show you how to build this interactive example that illustrates how SVG Goo works. Notice how when these objects touch each other, they sort of join with these nice curved paths. As they pass through, you'll see that they'll kind of do a little bit of a at the end when they become disconnected. And depending on where your shapes are and how they intersect, you can end up with these really interesting shapes. Before we get too deep, a few quick notes about Goo. Similar to the SVG warp filter from the previous lesson, there is no such thing as an official SVG Goo filter. Goo is just what folks have come to call the result of a certain combination of the FE Gaussian blur and FE color matrix filter primitives. And although we may not know the technical details of what all that means, I'm going to show you today that you really don't have to. In fact, I refer to SVG Goo as grab and go code. And what I mean by that is you can go to some place like CodePen and just search for SVG Goo, and you're going to come up with loads of great examples that use the exact same technique. In this slow drip example, you'll see there is an SVG with a Goo filter, FE Gaussian blur, and FE color matrix on it. This GUI menu has the same type of SVG with the same blur and the same color matrix that you'll see everywhere else. And I was thrilled to stumble across this example from Mitchell, who is a moderator in the GreenSock's forums. He's using a little bit of draw SVG magic combined with the Goo filter. But again, you're going to find that there is a blur and a color matrix filter primitive. In all these examples, there's maybe some slight variation in these two numbers here and the standard deviation of the blur. And we'll dive deeper into that in a bit. Oh hey, and real quick, if you could just take 1 second and like this video and subscribe to the channel, that would be a big help. Thank you so much. I got the idea for this lesson when a student asked me if I had any thoughts on how this flecto site was built. I was instantly intrigued by how all these different boxes sort of grew out from each other. And I was curious how they all joined together with these really smooth curves. Now, if I rewind just a little bit, watch what happens when these boxes build out of each other. They sort of maintain this connection here, and then they just sort of keep growing, and it's a very interesting effect. In this next section, you'll see it happening with larger elements. Again, I'll rewind and watch what happens as these elements grow out from the sides. You have these really smooth curves. And it reminded me of the SVG Goo filter, so I decided to make a very simple demo to see how it would do. And I came up with this example here. Up top, we're animating a div with a Goo filter, and down below, that's just an SVG rect. Now, the animation is fairly straightforward. We're just taking these elements and moving them down and scaling them a bit, and watch how they sort of have this connection going on with the element they appear to be coming out of. And then once they get to sort of full size, they're just going to stretch across. And this exact same animation with the Goo removed would look like this. See? It's just rectangles that are moving and stretching. So now that you've seen all this, let's go ahead and make some Goo. So as usual, I have a very basic file for us to use today. Everything is wrapped inside this demo div, and then there is a draggables div which contains my square and my circle. Now both of these elements also have the class of drag on them because I'm going to make them draggable, and beneath there we have a class of box. My CSS is fairly uneventful, but I do want to point out that the circle, square, and box are all using these vmin units so that everything is nice and responsive as I change the size of the window. Now to make the square and the circle draggable, I'm going to go over to the JavaScript panel, and in the settings, I want to show you that I'm already loading GSAP, but I also want GreenSock's draggable. So I'm going to type in drag. Draggable is the first thing to come up. I'll click, and then we see it will be loaded in. We'll save and close, and then now all I have to do is add draggable.create and pass in the class of drag. So now the square and the circle will both be draggable. So now let's add the Goo filter. I was a little sneaky before, and when I was showing you my HTML, I didn't show you that I have a hidden SVG up here. You'll notice that it has a view box of 0, a width of 0, and a height of 0. But what I want to demonstrate is that it still takes up some space or causes some shift of my demo element. So what I'm going to do is put a little marker right here so you can see the top of the square. And then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to paste in a style of display none. And on reload, you'll see we have a little bit of a shift that happened. So although it's minor, I figured it's worth pointing out. So display none will take our SVG out of the document flow and we'll still have access to its filters. With that said, let's take our Goo filter and apply it to our demo element. So let's hop into the CSS, and somewhere up here you'll see that we have our demo rule. And here I'm going to add filter URL Goo. And as soon as I do that, notice how everything gets blurry, all right? And you may even notice that our squares now have these rounded kind of blurred corners here. Everything is still draggable, but clearly it is very blurry. And the amount of blur is controlled in the HTML by this standard deviation of 8. If I made this something like 20, it would be super duper blurry. But I think around 8 is going to work fine for our purposes. Now that blur amount is easy to explain. What's not so easy to explain is this FE color matrix, which has this long string of values here, okay? Now, I can't even begin to tell you what each of these values does, but I believe Chris Gannon once said that it boosts the transparency of the semi-transparent parts that you see at the edges of the blur. So I'm going to go ahead and just uncomment that bit, and look, the blurriness goes away. What we're left with are these squares that have rounded corners, okay? So there's no more of that sort of semi-transparentness that happens with the blur. And clearly you can see here that the blue is blending into the red where they overlap. If I pull this dark blue circle away, look at how those things join, all right? It's pretty neat what's happening there. I'm going to pull the dark blue circle into the lighter blue square, and look what happens at these joins. We get these really smooth curved connections. And that's just a function of what happens when those two filter primitives are being combined. And although this looks pretty cool right now, what really makes this effect pop is when all the elements are the same color. So let's go into the CSS, and down here you'll see that we have a rule for square and circle, and I'm just going to uncomment this background of Dodger blue. And now you'll see that whenever these elements connect, it looks really neat, all right? So hopefully that helped you demystify exactly what a Goo filter is and how it works. And I want you to go back to those examples that I showed you, experiment with them, and try to build some of these things on your own. And before I go, I just want to go over this one file from the beginning and show you that my blobs div has a blobs class applied that has this Goo filter, all right? And so it's important to note that the filter goes on the parent element of the things that are going to be gooey. Similarly, in my SVG, you will notice there is a group with the Goo filter applied as well. And that's for these shapes down here, which is this rectangle and this rectangle. Now, as much as I think that this gets really close to what's going on in that flecto site, I have a closing confession and challenge. I poked around behind the scenes of the flecto site quite a bit, and although I found some SVGs, I really didn't find any evidence of a Goo filter. I found some rectangles, I found some other groups that had these complicated paths, but I scrolled around quite a bit and didn't see any Goo filters. I took a path like this and opened it up in Boxy SVG, and I found all these shapes that the site's using, but I'm kind of flustered on how they got the animation to work. So if you're up for it, I'd love for you to dig a little bit behind the scenes, and maybe you have something you can tell me about how this was actually made. Regardless, I hope you learned a lot about the Goo filter, and I look forward to seeing how you use it. And next week, I'll show you how I created this SVG Goo graphic, and maybe this is something you want to try right now. Give it a shot. Alright, that's a wrap, folks. I really hope you learned something cool that you can add to your own projects. Again, it really helps me if you take the time to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.